Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last Labour Mobility Research Talk for the year. I am Ryan Edwards, Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre, and hosting with me here today, I have Arachika Okazaki. As always, I would like to first stop to acknowledge and to celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. And for those of you unfamiliar with our centre, we are a think tank focused on improving the effectiveness of Australian aid, supporting the development of PNG in the Pacific, and contributing to better global development policy. Since most of our major 2020 events were cancelled due to the coronavirus, we introduced these monthly seminars as a way to keep the conversation going and to connect the region to some of the world's best researchers. Today, we have our very own Stephen Howes and Richard Curtin presenting a new report on the governance of Australia's seasonal worker program in Australia and in sending countries. Stephen is the Director of the Development Policy Centre and a Professor of Economics at the Crawford School, and before joining ANU, he was AusAid's first Chief Economist. Richard is a Research Fellow at Dev Policy, and Richard specialises in labour mobility and has worked on APTC, Fiji, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste and Tonga. So Stephen will present for around 40 minutes and Richard join in for the Q&A. We welcome important or clarifying questions throughout, but we'll hold a proper Q&A session at the end. So please do be sure to raise any questions that you have through the Q&A Zoom function, and then I'll moderate them in or unmute your microphone. Over to you, Stephen.
Okay, well, thanks, Ryan, and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Thanks a lot for joining us today. I just want to start with some thanks to various people. So thank you to Ryan for accommodating us in his Labour Mobility Research Seminar. We're really delighted to be able to launch our report as part of that series that I think has just been a terrific addition in a difficult year. I want to thank my co-author, Richard. Although I'm presenting today, Richard's there to help answer questions, take your comments, and also want to acknowledge that he really has done most of the research, especially in the sending countries, going out, writing the different reports over a period of several years now. I want to thank all our collaborators and contributors, to people who've helped us on this report, but also this really is a synthesis report. So people who've helped us and worked with us on various other projects that feed into this one. And that includes all those from the Australian government, New Zealand government, sending country governments, all the employers, the workers, NGOs, a whole range of people who have helped us on this long journey. Yes, so I wanted to put that in first. Now let me get to the presentation itself. I should go to share my screen. Yeah, so this is the report that we're launching today. And let me jump straight in with sort of the motivation for this report, which is a decade of growth in seasonal labour mobility. It's really been a remarkable trend across, combining both the seasonal worker program and the RSE. Of course, that growth has come to a sharp halt this year with COVID-19, and indeed start of last fiscal year. But in fact, with the increased publicity certainly given to the SWP in Australia, but also the RSE in New Zealand, we anticipate that as borders reopen, we expect this growth to continue. So it's already become important, and we think it's going to become more important. That's the aggregate level, but it's interesting to look down at the individual countries, and there we see this massive variation. We see one country, Vanuatu, really dominating the two schemes with 40% of the market share. Tonga with 30%, Samoa 15%, and the other countries are quite a long way behind. So very uneven distribution. And that's even more striking if you compare it to population. We often say that the SWP is not an aid program. And one of our indicators for that is that there are no country quotas, right? It's totally up to employers where they hire from. But if you imagined a scheme that was done with country quotas, then you'd think, well, participation would be pretty much proportional to population. And then the big countries would dominate, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Fiji. But that's in fact the opposite, as you can see here. This uses 2017-18 data, takes the male population as the denominator, because as we'll discuss, there's a lot of gender bias in these programs. But you can see Tonga, 13% of the Tonga male population goes to either Australia or New Zealand every year to work on farms. It's remarkable, right? Vanuatu's 8%. But down at the other end, Papua New Guinea doesn't even register on the scale. So we're really interested in this question of why some countries are more successful in the two schemes than others. And then the other sort of variation that we've become interested by and want to explain and understand is in how countries govern seasonal labor. There's a lot of variation. Right? There are three main methods you can use. You can, government itself can select the workers or pre-select, and then employers make the final selection. Or the employers can just recruit themselves through direct employer recruitment, or they can recruit through a licensed agent. And this is a simplified version of one of the tables in the report. You can see there's a whole mix of methods. Vanuatu, the biggest sender, is quite different. It's the only one to use licensed agents. It doesn't use a work-ready pool at all. Tonga has a work-ready pool, but doesn't really make much use of it. Makes much more use of direct employer recruitment. But Timor-Leste, the third biggest sender to Australia, only uses a work-ready pool, and so on. So there's a lot of variation. And, we're interested in understanding this and relating this to participation. So what is the report about? I think so far research on the seasonal worker program and the RSC is really focused on the question of benefits. What are the benefits of these schemes, both to workers and to employers? And I think we can say that so far that research has demonstrated that, yes, these schemes are of great benefit, both to employers. Employers get more productive workers, but also to workers. Workers earn a lot more than they would have if they didn't participate, and they like the scheme and they tend to come back. So what we're doing in this report is sort of shift the focus away from that, maybe more settled research question, to the newer question: how is labour mobility managed, both in the sending and receiving countries? Now, we base our work on a large number of countries, but the focus of the report, to make it manageable, is on Australia, on the SWP, and then in terms of sending countries, on the three biggest sending countries for the SWP, so Vanuatu, Tonga, and Timor-Leste. And then based on our analysis, we try to come up with some policy recommendations. We go to the should questions. How should it be managed? How to ensure the schemes keep growing? How can countries who've missed out get a bigger market share? And then it's not all about the numbers. How to promote equity in recruitment? How to protect worker welfare? So that's what the report is about. I want to acknowledge at the outset, there are definitely limitations to the report. Of course, you may find errors. Let us know if you do. I'm sure you won't all agree with all of what we say, and we welcome further discussion. But I want to particularly highlight, labour mobility is a new phenomenon in the Pacific. And so it's not surprising that governance arrangements, if you like, are immature, right? They're still developing. They're quite dynamic, and we've noticed that just as we've been finalising the report, not to mention that we're trying to finalise it during this COVID-19 period. So we readily admit that some of what's in the report will quickly become out of date, but that doesn't really concern us, right? We hope that the conclusions will be robust, right? Our policy recommendations will stand the test of time. But also, as I said, this is a synthesis report, and this sort of documentation is important. We hope this report will become a sort of a benchmark. People can look back. That's how the SWP was up to about 2020, and they can look at what the changes are and then try and assess whether the changes are for the better or for the worse. I want to just briefly, before I dive in, talk about some of the background research that we've done. Some of you will follow our blog, and you might notice on Monday we put up a blog about Fred Fisk from the 80s, about how there are too many reports written on the Pacific and they're not being read. And I realized afterwards, perhaps the timing of that blog wasn't perfect, just when I'm about to launch my own report. But I guess what we'd say in our defense is that, this report's not a one-off effort. It reflects an ongoing engagement. And we hope that kind of approach is more productive and effective and perhaps impactful in the end. But in any case, we have been working on this topic for a long time. I think we first started publishing in 2012. And since then, we've done 2 surveys of Australian farmers. We've done specific surveys of the SWP employers. We've done research into the New Zealand RSE as well. Richard has done fieldwork in 9 sending countries and reports on those countries. This report's both quantitative and qualitative. And it's not just our research, and we benefit greatly from the research of others as well in this report. Okay, well, it's not easy to summarize a 70-page report in a seminar presentation. So I'm mainly going to focus on the sending countries, but we do have a whole section, section 2, on governance of the seasonal worker program in Australia. And so I'm going to start with that and then come back to it in the end in recommendations. And this is just one aspect of that discussion of governance of the SWP. But we do find it interesting and useful to compare the SWP and the RSE, because in many ways they're very similar schemes, similar designs, introduced just a couple of years apart. But on the ground, they're quite different. And this table is not actually in the report, but it brings together those differences between the SWP and the RSE. So just to run through it quickly, when you look at the employers who use the 2 schemes, the SWP is much more dominated by large labour hire companies. Whereas the RSE, we could just say, has a more diverse employer base. The demand trajectories of the 2 schemes have been quite different. The SWP started off very slowly. Our initial research was trying to explain the low take-up, but it's then, since in more recent times, it's grown very rapidly. RSE is the opposite. It had initially very rapid growth. It reached the cap, but since then, the growth has been constrained by the size of the cap. Whereas Australia, with the low growth initially, got rid of the cap, and so now the growth has picked up. It's unconstrained by any cap, and so it can be quite rapid, and has been. The geography of the 2 schemes is very different. Of course, Australia is a much bigger country, but also the fruit and vegetable growing areas are quite widely dispersed across Australia. The sectoral characteristics are quite different. In Australia, farmers are mainly producing for the domestic market, and they have to be very price conscious because of the pressures from the major supermarket chains. Whereas RSE, farmers are more producing the export markets and are more quality and reputation conscious. Of course, these are some big generalizations, but we do back them up with data in the report. In terms of level of compliance with labour laws, I think it's well known that's been an issue for the horticultural sector, but we would say compliance is improving now as a result of a number of media exposures and government reports and action, public pressure. RSE, I think there was a big clean out when the RSE was introduced more than a decade ago, and compliance is higher. A big difference is in the role of the backpackers. Australia at first was unwilling to introduce a seasonal worker program, and so instead gave incentives to backpackers to work on farms. And that's a major difference. There are about 4 backpackers working on farms for every seasonal worker, and New Zealand is the opposite ratio. Role of industry, RSE was really an industry-driven scheme, whereas in Australia, the SWP came out of the development sector. So the role of industry was actually marginal, but it is growing. And there is now, very importantly, an association of improved employers, making representations to government. The 2 schemes are managed quite differently by the government. In Australia, it's managed out of employment. In RSE, it's what's called business innovation and employment. And we argue in the report, in Australia, the management of the scheme is more focused on compliance, whereas in New Zealand, it's more focused on problem solving. All right, so there's a lot there. There are a lot of assertions, and happy to take questions on it, but I'm just going to park that for now, then go onto the sending country side, and then try and bring it together through our conclusions and recommendations. All right, so let's go on to sending country governance. As I said, we focus on these three major countries, but we start with a general section, section 3, that provides some general observations. So first, as I've already mentioned, Australia and New Zealand don't tell sending countries how to do it. It's up to them. And so we do observe this diversity across sending countries in how they manage their labour mobility. In terms of why some countries do better than others, of course, we argue governance matters, but clearly it's not the only thing. There are some countries that are disadvantaged, if you like, by bad luck. For example, if you're particularly remote, say in the case of Kiribati, if you have law and order problems, in the case of Papua New Guinea, that's going to deter employers. On the positive side, the countries that have done well have benefited to some extent from luck, and in particular, we talk about the first or early mover advantage. So in the case of Tonga, Tonga did well early on in Australia because of the Tongan diaspora that was able to link workers to farms. Vanuatu did well because New Zealand supported its participation in that country, and then they were able to leverage that to do well in Australia. But it's not all about luck, right? And Timor-Leste is a good example, a country that didn't have a first or even an early mover advantage. It was a latecomer, but has really been able to generate a lot of growth and success. Another general point we make in the report for understanding how this scheme works is about the importance of return workers. I think the two mistakes are made with return workers. First, we just sort of forget they exist. It's easy to think that every visa goes to a new worker, but in fact, most workers coming to Australia now are return workers, right? And that's because employers like return workers because they're the ones who are reliable and productive. And just to show you a bit of the data on this, this is data from successive years, but it's interesting how consistent it is over time. In terms of first to second year, only 60% of workers make it back for a second year. So the other 40% are the ones who decide they don't like it, or the employers decide they're not good enough, they're not going to be invited back. But once you make it back to the second year, you've got a 70 to 80% chance of coming back for your third year, fourth year, and so on. Now, on average, workers don't make a career out of the seasonal worker program. The average number of trips is about 4, right? So it's not 10 or 20, but it's certainly bigger than 1. And this is a survey not by us, but by Cardno a few years ago, asking employers. And in terms of new workers, it's like, okay, they're okay in terms of dependability, enthusiasm, productivity, but return workers, yeah, they're fantastic, right? They're dependable, enthusiastic, and productive. So these workers, they sort of self-select, right? Because they prove themselves, and so they're invited back. So the first mistake we make is to forget about the importance of return workers, but the second is to think, well, then there's a trade-off, right? And they're monopolizing the jobs and they're preventing new workers from coming in, and that's unfair. But we argue, and we have some data for this in the report, that's a false dichotomy. The more return workers you have in a country, the more new workers you're going to get. Because if you have a lot of return workers, that means employers like recruiting from your country. And they're always going to need new workers. Old workers drop out. They want to expand. And so they're going to go looking for those new workers in your country. So that's on return workers. And then when it comes to recruitment, of course, we'll go through country by country. But one general point we just want to make at the outset is it's very clear employers have a strong preference for flexible recruitment. They don't like work-ready pools. And again, this is from the Cardno survey. It was a small survey, but it's very telling in that none of the employers indicated a preference for the work-ready pool as a recruitment method. They want more control over the recruitment process. And that follows on from, when you're hiring a new worker, you really don't know who you're getting. So you want to ask someone you trust to select those workers for you. And just coming in a work-ready pool, that doesn't have that same degree of trust. So you either ask a return worker or another intermediary you've been working with, a licensed agent. And that it's that need to have someone you can trust, the high degree of uncertainty that really explains the strong preference for flexible recruitment. And then just a final point before I go to the 3 countries, there's definitely very sharp gender inequity in the seasonal worker program. It's less than 20% of the workforce are women. If you want to look for the positives, so we do better than New Zealand. The gender inequity in the RSE is even worse. And it is improving. It was about 13, 14, and now it's up at 18. So it is getting better. And that's because Timor-Leste is becoming a bigger player. They have the best representation of women. And also because of improving participation from women from Tonga, which we'll talk a bit about. But that's certainly a challenge for the future. Okay, so now, going on to these 3 countries. These are the 3 in-depth case studies that we present in our report, like sections 4, 5, and 6. And this graph shows the combined market share of those 3 countries in the SWP. And you can see it's around 90%, right, for most years between the 3. But quite a lot of churn within the 3, in particular with Tonga, really losing market share to Vanuatu first, and then more recently to Timor-Leste. So Ryan, maybe just interrupt me if there are any chat comments or anything, queries that I should respond to. Otherwise, I'll keep.
You have 2 in the Q&A, which you may want to just pick up briefly so we can clear the deck and keep going on to new ones as they arise if you want. I can read it. The first one is asking, could or should Australia consider skilled and trained SWP, further visa provisions for training and skilled migration in the farming and horticulture industry?
Yeah, no, I can see them, Ryan.
Yeah, cool.
I'd say, I think that's a policy question. So we'll just come to the policy at the end.
Yeah,
and definitely the changes in Vanuatu. Yeah, so I think that's the next slide. So we can deal with them that way, I think.
Perfect.
Okay, so here's Vanuatu, and this is showing, we do analyze these 3 countries with respect to both SWP and the RSE. Timor-Leste is only involved with the SWP. But here's Vanuatu in both schemes, and the columns are the numbers, the lines are the market share. So you see Vanuatu's done really well. It has a very consistent market share of between 40 and 50% in the RSE since inception. And SWP, it's come up from basically 0 to 40%. So it's become the biggest single sender to both schemes, as well as the biggest sender over time. And it's really distinctive, right? It's got a unique governance system to manage seasonal workers. It doesn't bother with the work-ready pool. And it has this unique system of licensed agents that employers use to arrange their recruitment. Now, you don't have to use a licensed agent. You can also use direct recruitment, basically hire people yourselves, perhaps with an informal intermediary. But these are the two methods. And SWP employers mainly use licensed agents, RSE more likely to use direct recruitment. But now, as someone has just put up in their comment, in fact, just as we're finalizing the report, the government announced it's going to abolish this governance system and replace it by some sort of work-ready pool. So it's a really radical reform. It's really like a revolution in the most important sending country. So not surprisingly, it's got a lot of publicity. So we made our position clear. I mean, we've made it clear in the final version of the report, which we revised, and we've also written some blogs about this. I mean, our position is clear that Vanuatu's system has worked well. You just look at the numbers and how it's dominated. It does have issues, and clearly, no one's saying it's perfect. It needs to be improved, but it should be reformed rather than abolished. And in fact, Vanuatu put out a labour mobility policy, I think last year, And there are a lot of good recommendations in that should be followed through on. And if followed through on, will deal with the sort of concerns the government has. So far it is an announcement from the Vanuatu government. It's not actually, they actually need to change their legislation. So it remains to be seen whether they'll do that. But in terms of what we think Vanuatu government should do, we think they need to put in more resourcing. You know, they have been successful. It has become a major industry. It needs to be resourced accordingly. And in particular, Vanuatu is unique in not having a in-country presence. Right? The other big sending countries, Timor-Leste, Tonga, have someone in Australia to help with workers, you know, if workers are exploited, if there's absconding. In Vanuatu, the High Commissioner is very busy and dedicated on this issue, but really needs support from a dedicated officer. And, you know, we understand Vanuatu is planning to do that in the coming year. In terms of the licensed agents, as we said, the systems work well, but there are too many agents who've now been licensed, not necessarily actually with any workers to facilitate. And also the regulation has been lax. So not all agents have been well behaved. So we think fewer and better regulated agents. And then on the issue of equitable recruitment, which is the one the government highlighted in making the major policy change, we think that is an issue. When you look at the numbers, there is underrepresentation from outer islands, and there isn't a good gender balance. But we think you can act on that through incentives, you know, basically either incentivizing or even directing employers, agents to go out and hire more from the outer islands, to hire more women. Right? You don't need to go to a work-ready pool to get more equitable outcomes. So that's Vanuatu. Yeah, I get a few more comments that we'll take up in the questions. But I think Tess has commented this reform may not happen, which I guess is good news. We think it would be a sort of our own goal, and employers will leave Vanuatu, and so it'll become an opportunity for other countries to get market share. Okay, then Tonga is our second major sender, and this is the trajectory for Tonga. It's had quite a constant market share of the RSE at around 20%, but it dominated the SWP early on, but has really lost market share in Australia. In terms of how Tonga is governed, that is how seasonal work is governed in Tonga, it's actually very similar to Vanuatu, except that the agents aren't licensed. Right? You don't need a license to be an intermediary, so it's a more informal system. And, you know, being similar, it probably has similar strengths and weaknesses. In terms of why Tonga lost market share, especially to Vanuatu, we think it's around reputational problems. Tonga a few years ago got a reputation for its workers absconding. And if you look back at the trajectory, you can see that numbers from Tonga sort of flatlined for a few years. But to its credit, Tonga did go ahead, put a liaison officer in Australia. And that, I mean, absconding has become a problem with COVID-19 for all countries. But pre-pandemic, Tonga got the absconding problem under control. And you can see 2018-19 was actually a really good year for Tonga. In terms of equity, we think Tonga does better than Vanuatu in terms of regional equity. And as I mentioned, is showing improved gender equity with quite a steep trajectory over the years. I think this is a really interesting subject and needs to be further researched as to why this is happening and what the implications are. But a positive development. All right, and then the third country is Timor-Leste. So Timor-Leste only participates in the SWP, not the RSE. But Timor-Leste is interesting as a latecomer, right? Didn't have an early mover advantage, but has really been able to pick up market share and has now reached 14%. Timor-Leste is also interesting because it has a very different model to Vanuatu and Tonga. It relies on work-ready pool, right? The work-ready pool is front and center for Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste is also a country that's been changing. Earlier, Timor-Leste had a work-ready pool, but allowed employers to make flexible use of it, in that if you could recommend workers to be added to the work-ready pool, right? And they could then be selected out of. And so in that way, employers could get the flexibility that they needed. But the problem with that from Timor-Leste's point of view was that then other workers who were in the work-ready pool earlier, just languished, right? They never moved up the queue. And so they were dissatisfied with that. And so Timor-Leste just recently, before the pandemic, said that this will no longer be allowed. That employers will no longer be able to nominate workers for the work-ready pool. And this has generated a very negative employer response. Timor-Leste is also interesting because it's had the strongest in Australia presence of the sending countries. It's had very active promotion in Australia, which explains some of that gain in market share. But it's also had some of the administration done out of Canberra. It's a very intensive process, not just selecting a worker, right? They've got to have a health test, they've got to have a police check, right? They need to have a visa, they need to come on a plane at the right time. And a lot of that work was done out of Canberra. But again, Timor-Leste seems to have been going the opposite direction. It's kind of shut down that Canberra support. And again, we think that's going to make it more difficult. We'll also just highlight some other issues that Timor-Leste has had with the work-ready pool. I've already mentioned that unrealistic expectations. And now there are some 8,000 people in the work-ready pool. And of course, because return workers keep going back, it's going to take a very long time to work through those 8,000 if they ever do. And in the meantime, the people not selected, once you get in the work-ready pool, you have this expectation, well, look, I'm going to be heading off soon. And in fact, that may not be the case. In terms of equity, Timor-Leste has done best on gender, as I mentioned. But in terms of regional equity, it's done really poorly. And Timor-Leste has the highest number of workers under the seasonal worker program who left a job to join the SWP. And from an equity point of view, that's not great. You really want people who are unemployed, living in rural areas. So that just shows, we think, that having a work-ready pool isn't a guarantee of equitable recruitment. We need to find other methods to promote equity. All right, well, that's a quick run through of our analysis, and I'm going to now go to the conclusions and recommendations. So because there is so much diversity in terms of how countries arrange their labour mobility, each of the three I've discussed is different, and then there are 9 or 10 in all. They're all different to some extent or another. So to make sense of it, we've developed these two categories: government central and government light. And government central, it's like the names suggest, government central is where the government takes that central role. Has a work-ready pool, does the associated regulation, pre-departure briefings, and so on. Government light, you don't worry about a work-ready pool, and the employer takes a much bigger role, not just in selection of workers, but also in the regulatory aspects of visa processing, helping with the pre-departure briefings, and so on. And this, combined with a sort of intermediary category, is useful because then we can then classify the countries, I think there are 10, that participate in the SWP into these three categories. So we put Vanuatu and Tonga as government light, Timor-Leste, PNG, Kiribati, Nauru, Tuvalu. These are all the work-ready pool countries, government central. And then Fiji, Solomons, and Samoa use a bit of both. And so we just call them as they're in the intermediate in-between category. So this is to try to make sense of what otherwise can be sort of very messy and unwieldy. I mean, the point is not to say that there's a single best form of sending country governance, right? But that's not to say we can't say anything. Clearly, successful countries, as we discussed before, and as we show in the report, they have a high ratio of return workers. And the other thing about successful countries that I haven't talked about is that they attract large employers, right? And that's useful because they can expand rapidly. Often they're labour hire companies. So they just need to recruit new farmers to recruit for, but also they can take on some of the regulatory burden for you. But then, of course, how do you become successful? How do you get a high ratio of return workers, and how do you attract large employers? As I mentioned, there are exogenous factors, but we do think responsive, scalable, well-resourced governance leads to success. There is no single first best model. A good example of that is the licensed agents. It's worked really well for Vanuatu, but Solomon Islands said, okay, we'll copy that model. It didn't work at all, and they've abandoned it. So it's not a matter of looking for what some other country does and copying it. But we do think a good lesson is that the two extremes, government central and government light, are both to be avoided. As we've already mentioned, there's no support among employers for the work-ready pool. So don't put all your eggs in that basket. But on the other side, once you are successful, you do need to match that growth in numbers with the growth in resources. And that growth in resources is going to take you away from the government light approach to somewhere in the middle, which is where we think you want to be. Okay, so to finish, I think we have some 12 recommendations, and they cover recommendations for the sending countries. Then I'm going to come back to recommendations for Australia. And then, because obviously it's like trade, it involves both sides. So how should the two parties interact? And then finally, we do have a section on COVID-19. So what are particular recommendations relating to that? So let's start with the sending country governments. I think the first recommendation, like we've already made pretty clear, we don't recommend exclusive reliance on the work-ready pool. To put that in a positive way, recommendation 2, we think sending governments should use the private sector to take on governance functions, right? It's a lot of work to run a labour mobility program. If the private sector is willing to help you get visas, process health checks, help with pre-departure briefings, yeah, you should do that. Otherwise, you run the risk of becoming a bottleneck. And if you're a bottleneck, employers will look, experience has shown employers will look elsewhere. But then balancing that, recommendation 3, most countries need to provide increased resourcing to the government's labour mobility as numbers grow, both at home and abroad, right? And that's especially a recommendation for Vanuatu. And then finally, you might think we're dealing mainly with the successful countries. What about those countries, say like Papua New Guinea, that want to break into the market? It's not easy because companies, while they want to diversify, they don't want to work in too many countries, right? It's just transaction costs are too high. But Timor-Leste shows it can be done, and especially in Australia, where there is no cap, right? There is that scope for new countries to break in to the market. And what we have as our recommendation 4 is that the main priority for these countries has to be responsiveness to employer needs. Right? If you can establish a good reputation with a few employers, then by word of mouth, other employers will start coming to you for workers. All right, so now to cycle back to Australia, right, which is where we started with the Australia-New Zealand comparison. We do have 4 recommendations, sort of really building off that matrix I showed you a while ago. The first one goes to exploitation. I know some people want the SWP to be even more tightly regulated to even further reduce the chance of exploitation. But research has shown that SWP workers are the least likely to be exploited. So what we propose is much more a sector-wide approach to reduce exploitation sector-wide. That will actually make it more of a level playing field for SWP and will benefit all workers. So we've long argued against this funneling of backpackers onto farms and for more regulation of labour hire companies. I mean, this is happening, but it needs to go a lot further. The next 2 recommendations really go to this issue of industry ownership. We mentioned that SWP really came out of the development sector. Industry is now taking more ownership, especially the Approved Employers Association. There is a multi-stakeholder group for the SWP, which is fine, but we argue there should be a particular a reference group which brings together employers and the government and talks about their common challenges and makes employers feel like they own the scheme, that it's responsive to them. After all, these are the good employers, right? They're the employers willing to be subject to this very tight regulation. We want more people to come on board, and for that, the employers need to be able to own the scheme. So that's what recommendation 6 is about, and recommendation 7 is similar in that we think rather than being in the Department of Employment, which has a general mandate to protect Australian workers, we think SWP should be seen as a scheme for agriculture and therefore located in the Department of Agriculture. Recommendation 8 goes to the dispersed nature of the SWP and the problems that can arise from that, whether it's to do with pay or accommodation and so on. And you need to get the managers out of Canberra into the field. And in fact, this was announced in the recent budget. The government's going to start moving in this direction. So that's great. Then going to how the sending countries and receiving countries should interact with each other, because you can't have the governance done totally in isolation. There are now annual labour mobility conferences that bring everyone together, like a jamboree. But what we really argue is missing and needs to be added are bilateral or perhaps trilateral with Australia and New Zealand and the particular sending country, where you can sit down and talk to each other about what problems you're having. And if you're a sending country and you're unhappy about the treatment of workers or their pay, you can discuss that. If you're a receiving country, you're unhappy about the preparation workers get, you can talk about that. You can have a frank discussion because it's just the relevant parties. So we think this kind of annual monitoring mechanism would really go a long way to putting in place a sort of positive dynamic for governance improvement. That's for governments, but then for employers, our recommendation is that, especially for the bigger employers who are really now hiring in the thousands, they need to have more of a presence in the countries they hire from. Then finally, COVID-19, it was there while we were drafting up the report. It's a rapidly changing situation, so I'm not going to go into any detail, but we do see it as kind of opportunity to push through some of the changes we've suggested. So this reference group with employers and the government, now would be an ideal time to set that up, because there are pressing problems facing SWP, not surprisingly, with the border closure. And then also we think now would be a good time to set up new bilateral agreements because you can't have business as usual under COVID-19. And these would then be the basis for those annual bilateral or trilateral review mechanisms. All right, so I think I've pretty much used up my 40 minutes. I'm going to stop here. Please do have a look at the report, or at least the executive summary, which is up on the website. And I think I forgot in my earlier thanks to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because this research is made possible by their Pacific Research Program, for which we're very grateful. So thank you, and back to you, Ryan.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. So let's move on to questions. A little bit of housekeeping on how I think we're going to do this. So we have a bunch in the Q&A, which we'll selectively move through. Stephen, you can see all them and we can kind of pick them out as we go. But it is nicer to have it a bit more interactive. And so please do raise your hand and then I can allow you to speak or mute your mic accordingly. And I just small apologies in advance if we don't come to you. The reason we've got the registration, so the reason may be that you haven't provided enough information in the registration, which is there as a security measure and to benefit everyone. So with that, let's go over to the hands, and we have Stephen Burdett first. Let me allow you to talk. Can you hear me, Stephen? And unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I just want to commend you. I'm actually the chair of the Approved Employers of Australia. This organisation or association we formed in 2019, and I can already write a volume of books on our experiences. But I just wanted to commend you on such great research and such good information. And we really appreciate what you do and the support that you give us. And a lot of these, I made notes on a lot of these issues because we as an association are very happy to work alongside you to address many of these issues because they are very valid at this stage. So thank you.
Cool.
Thank you, Steve.
I'll take that as a comment, I guess. Thanks, Steve. Nick McClellan.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ryan. Steve, I wonder if you could comment about how the schemes both in Australia and New Zealand have evolved differently under coalition or Labor governments in terms of the way in which different governments have responded to things like industry planning which was evident in RSE in the very early days, having round tables of all partners to develop industry policy. That certainly wasn't the case in Australia. About the role of unions in worker protection, about other areas like that. Do you see the fact that how these have evolved under Labor and or coalition governments as being a relevant factor?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. That's a great question, which I'd love to address. I'll address that, then I'll ask Richard, because Richard's probably had more time than me to go through all the written comments. And if there are any particular ones, Richard, you want to respond to, I'll hand over to you.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's fascinating, Nick, because, it's the first coalition government, not the first, but the previous one under John Howard, wouldn't introduce the seasonal worker program, right? They were against it. It was raised and they refused. And they instead introduced this backpacker second-year visa if you worked on a farm, which created, I think, solved the immediate labour shortage problem, but created so many other problems. So that was the first stage. Second stage was Labor. Labor, I think they wanted to show they were more responsive to the Pacific. They introduced this seasonal worker program. But I think they were also very worried. They were very scared of the unions, which you mentioned, and so they were very timid about it. And our first survey that we did in 2012 is like most farmers hadn't heard of the seasonal worker program, right? It just wasn't known about, and that was one of the reasons. Plus the big surge of backpackers that there was such little usage of the scheme. So yeah, you have to give Labor credit for introducing it, but also note they were very timid. And then I think the third phase is the current phase, and Julie Bishop might go down in history as the person who really cut Australian aid, but she also really promoted the scheme. And, she and her advisors had this good idea, while the scheme was small, let's get rid of the cap, right? Which, why do we need a cap, right? And why does New Zealand have a cap? But, it was much easier to do that when the scheme's small, probably than it would be now. And they also got on the front foot about it, and they've really promoted this scheme, and that's now fed into a much bigger narrative. It's not just about the Pacific, it's about stopping exploitation in the sector. So it's not really an anti-union theme. I think it's like a pro-worker theme. So yeah, I think there is an interesting political economy behind the seasonal worker program that's worked in its favor over these years. And the next challenge I think is to, how do we go beyond the seasonal worker program? We've got the Pacific Labour Scheme, which is there for 3 years, but we should now be looking at permanent migration options. And that's another story. Richard.
Okay, well, let me answer some of the questions here. Ones that stand out for me are, what are the implications for Vanuatu of the proposed change from licensed agents to government work pool? We've discussed that in the presentation, but I think if you want more detail, there's a blog that I wrote on the 20th of November about the sorts of reforms I think that will be necessary if you continued with licensed agents. And I know that Tess Newton-Khan has replied to say that she doesn't, it's still not clear whether these reforms will go ahead. There's a 12-month transition period, and it's still yet to pass through Parliament. On other questions that stood out for me was do you have an analysis of the distribution of agricultural sectors that different sending countries work in, and whether some industries, for example, mangoes, prefer workers from some countries over others? We don't have that detailed information, and I think that's one of the difficulties we've battled with, is getting detailed data on what actually happens on the ground. But certainly there are particular countries that are connected to particular employers, and it has to do with the crops and their arrangements, but we can't give you a definitive answer on how that process is working. Somebody else has asked, are there any recommendations for effective pre-departure briefing with regard to infection control? We emphasised in the recommendations on COVID, related to COVID-19, that there is a need for a new bilateral agreement that includes issues like the matters that are covered in pre-departure briefings. Clearly, they need to be greatly improved because of the new situation workers are coming into. Some of the other questions, how effective is the pastoral care system in dealing with issues and problems that arise in particular locations? I think it depends. I got a comment this morning from the Timorese ambassador who just been to visit workers in Griffith, and she said that workers were very happy with their arrangements there because any problems that arose with the approved employer, they were able to address. And I think in general, the principle that if a problem can be resolved as close as possible to where it arises, then it's got a much greater chance of being resolved. So pastoral care offers that opportunity, but also having access to a liaison officer that the workers trust or have greater capacity to communicate with, perhaps, is an important part of resolving their problems. Rob Christie has asked, should currently low-sending countries target a geographic area or sector to break into, scale up to? It's not just a matter of targeting the areas. If you did, you'd need to be able to convince employers that there are people that can manage the transition, the transaction costs that are involved in engaging with that country. That seems to be a major concern that employers have. And if they feel that there are people that can resolve issues without causing lots of uncertainties for them, then they're more willing to commit to that sending government.
Let's go back to the audience questions just for a moment, Richard.
Okay.
That was great. We powered through a lot of them. Oh, a bunch more have come in as we've done that. But Susan Love, are you there and able to join by the mic?
Hello, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm a researcher in the Parliamentary Library. Thanks again for the presentation and the report today. I think I gather from the report that there's still plenty of there's plenty of supply, let's say, in terms of numbers of workers in the Pacific Islands who are wanting to come up to Australia and New Zealand under the schemes. But we've also got some groups advocating to open up the scheme to other countries, for example, Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines, for example. I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Stephen, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, as we say, it's not an aid program, but the countries are chosen for development/strategic reasons, right? And this is, and it's not unusual. I mean, New Zealand does the same, but Canada does the same with the Caribbean. So, you know, I think the way to understand it, the Australian government's decision is that these are opportunities. It's not like they wouldn't be of value to the Philippines, but a country like the Philippines or Vietnam, they've got so many more options, whereas the development pathways are so much more constrained for the Pacific. And if you opened it up to Asian countries, definitely, because as Richard said, that they can offer lower transaction costs, lower flights, employers would flock, they would desert the Pacific. So you would totally antagonize the Pacific. It would be a strategic error. And that's why Australia's not going to do it, despite these calls from industry. I just don't see Australia doing this because it would be such a diplomatic disaster, and especially now the Pacific's become so important from a strategic perspective. So yeah, farmers have to accept, you know, they're getting this great scheme, but they're going to have to recruit from the Pacific. And, you know, if you talk to the improved employers, I mean, the Pacific has good workers. As you said, I mean, there's no problem with supply, right? We could massively increase the numbers and not go anywhere near running out of workers from the Pacific. So I think, you know, in the end, employers will live with this reality. This is a scheme for the Pacific. And the whole COVID-19 and the publicity is just going to kind of increase the profile and the acceptability of this as a scheme that's targeted on the Pacific.
Great. I might pick out two questions from the chat because I've got that privilege as chair, and then go back to the audience again for a moment. We have one from Diane Barr asking for specific recommendations to increase PNG numbers. And Olivia Dunn has noting the seventh recommendation about moving it to then DAF, so agriculture, and asking whether you think there's scope for the management of the SWP to be cross-cutting and by multiple departments, and whether having it in one place risks development needs being overlooked.
Richard's written a report on PNG in the SWP, so maybe you take that one, Richard.
So what was the question again for the PNG one?
How to increase numbers?
Yes, there's a paper of mine written about that, which is available on our in our publication section on the website. Basically, it involves setting up close links with employers and allowing employers to be involved in the selection process. I think there are reforms in place at the moment to move out of Port Moresby and to ensure that particular 4 regions have an opportunity to send workers. That's an important part of ensuring that PNG is attractive by getting workers that have a background in agricultural work. One of the problems that PNG made was that they imposed a limitation of year 10 education, which biased it towards people who were in clerical jobs in Port Moresby. And they were very poor agricultural workers. But even with these reforms they proposed, they're still making it difficult for employers to get direct contact with the villagers to be able to take a lead in the actual selection process. So I think that that's one big change that PNG could make that would make a difference.
Great, thank you, Richard. Go back to the audience. So
Well, we've got that other question about Department of Agriculture.
oh yes, so Richard, do you want, or Stephen, do you want to comment on that quickly?
Yeah, Richard?
Well, basically, important that the department running the program has a strong sense of how the program needs to be promoted and connected to the needs of employers. And I think the SWP under the Department of Employment has largely operated in a reactive way with a strong emphasis on compliance and has not promoted the program in the way that I think the Department of Agriculture would be in a better place to do.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Samson has his hand up for a moment. Are you able to unmute, Samson?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for presenting this thorough report that I think it's very interesting, and the figures are so interesting in looking at different comparisons between the SWP and RSC, and I think definitely we could learn a lot from both schemes and see where we could improve at the country level, but also at the country level, meaning from the sending countries, but also from the receiving countries. I look at the report, I haven't read it completely, and thanks Richard for sending the report to me. As I can see that Vanuatu has a high stake in both schemes, labor mobility, and I'm happy to see that the study comparisons between both countries have clearly shown the numbers of workers that are sent to Australia and New Zealand. When I look at the report, I think there is one thing that I would like to have more clarifications on it as well, in terms of the governance system from the receiving countries. I seem to see that the report hasn't touched much on the governance system that is in place in the receiving countries and how we can improve that. And for myself, I cover Australia, and I would like to see more of the work done in terms of the governance system from here, from Australia, on the receiving country, as far as the receiving country is concerned. Probably looking in terms of of how we can improve that as well here. I have been involved in the labor mobility arena for over a year now, and I think that I see a lot of things that could be also improved from the receiving country side in better positioning itself, not only in receiving the workers from these countries and providing them to the approved employers, but also in helping our country like Vanuatu to shape their policies when it comes to labor mobility, as a sending country. Things that I'm looking at, for example, I would like to state the fact that I think there are different parties in Australia that are interested in the labor mobility, and meaning obviously the approved employers. And I'm glad to hear Steve is here as well online. We've had a few meetings with Steve, and also from DESI's point of view as well. I'm not sure if somebody from DESI is listening, but also from other stakeholders, of course, DFAT and Pacific Labour Facility, but also National Farmers Federation, Department of Agriculture as well here in Australia. So I seem to see that there's a disconnection between different parties, and it would be good to see in the governance structure how these parties can be brought together to be more involved with the high commissions and embassies here in Australia, but also to be more involved with different stakeholders that have an interest in labor mobility. So I'd like to see that. In terms of liaison officers as well, I think there's in the governance structure, this could be also a proposition that we would like to make as well in terms of financing that liaison officer. And I think Stephen mentioned clearly that some countries have not haven't got any liaison officers, and we can see that despite the fact that there's a lack of liaison officer, countries are still moving forward in working together and making sure that, for example, in the case of Vanuatu, we haven't got one. But it would be something to look into it as well in terms of co-financing the liaison officer. This could be something that, we would like to see also in the governance structure, that liaison officers should not only probably be entirely financed by their sending countries, but also from the receiving countries, that they should also contribute in financing the position itself. I understand that there is a $10,000 for liaison officers for their travel purposes, but this could also be something that could be added into the financing of the position itself here. It could be a position that could be co-financed by both receiving and sending country.
We're just about at time though.
Yeah.
Would you mind just wrapping up briefly, please?
Yeah, my last, I think the other thing that I noticed that could be probably missing in the report would be in terms of the social impact of seasonal workers. I don't seem to see it clearly stated in the report itself in terms of governance. How is this labor mobility thing has an impact on the sending countries, especially on the social level, but also in Australia itself in terms of how do we involve the diaspora? Could that be also included in the governance structure as well from receiving and sending countries in terms of how do we involve the diaspora better? Because we understand that we have a lot of issues in terms of labor mobility, and sometimes it goes as far as pastoral care and how probably the approved employers are not providing the pastoral care that is needed. But how can we also involve the diaspora in there as well? So I'll stop here and I'll try and wait for some answers. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to point out that Samson is the High Commissioner for Vanuatu to Australia, so that his comments come from those experiences. Look, Samson, we are preparing a blog on the recent initiative of the SWP program to allocate $9 million to setting up labour mobility offices and to funding members of the diaspora to take a greater role in welfare. I've got some reservations about the limitations of the role that they'll be playing, but I think it is an issue that does need more attention. Stephen, any other comments?
Thank you, High Commissioner. We take on board a lot of what you say. I would say in our defence, I mean, we do try to take a very balanced approach. Perhaps I didn't reflect that as much in my presentation, but we have a long section on governance in Australia, and then we have equal number of recommendations for Australia as for sending countries. So actions needed on all sides. I mean, I think the one issue I take, or the one suggestion where I'd take issue with you is that Australia should pay for the liaison officer, or even for some of it. I mean, in one sense, yes, Australia gives a lot of aid to Vanuatu, you could use some of it. But on the other hand, we know once Australia starts paying for something, ownership is weaker. And we really think Vanuatu needs to take ownership of this. And you need to raise the revenue one way or another. And you could, one suggestion we've made is to have a levy on returning workers and to use that to fund these critical positions that are for their benefit. But we look forward to further discussions with you on this, and thanks a lot for your input.
Great. Well, we are just about at time. Unless Stephen and Richard, did you want to pull out any further questions from the Q&A that you would particularly like to comment on? Maybe have a quick browse there. And in the meantime, we'll take one last question from Randall, who does have a few in there. Maybe you can pick your most important one to go on voice. If you can unmute yourself, Randall.
Yeah. Okay. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Look, because of my involvement through the World Bank survey with RSC and SWP, and now with Sustinio with the PLS and 30 years of involvement in the Pacific, one of the things that has struck me is the significant cultural differences between Pacific Islanders and, as it were, mainstream Australian culture, and wondering if there is sufficient attention given to those cultural differences that might actually enhance the experience for both workers and employers in dealing with issues of governance and the effectiveness of how the program runs on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Randall. Richard, Stephen?
Look, happy to accept that as a comment.
Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to speak to in the Q&A?
Look, I think just reassure people that we will answer their questions in the Q&A by giving a written response.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, there's so many good questions, Ryan. We could go for a lot longer.
Exactly. That's what I'm worried about. Yeah, we're already at 10 minutes over. So yeah, big thank you for everyone for the contributions and the questions and comments in there. I'm sure they'll be helpful for us in future work and in communicating the findings. So yeah, just to wrap up, big thank you for everyone for joining us today. We're at over 100. We're still at 85 now. So it was a popular talk. Thank you, guys. And I just wanted to reiterate what Stephen said at the start, which is that these events and just about everything that you see us doing on labour mobility and economic development in the Pacific is part of the Australian Government's Pacific Research Program. And we are grateful that they help us create these often critical, but nonetheless very important spaces for discussion. Please do stay tuned for more from us in the new year. And we do hope that you all have a very wonderful and relaxing break. Take care of yourselves and thank you again. See you next time.